My name is Jessica Byron. I am the director of the Institute of International Relations. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you, members of the diplomatic community, our distinguished guests who are joining us from on Zoom, Ambassador Gail Mathurin, of the CARICOM Office of Trade Negotiations, and Mr. Hiet Laporte, the Deputy Director of the European Center for Development Policy Management. Very special welcome to you both, and thank you for taking the time to be with us. I would also like to welcome the members of our panel, Dr. Anita Montut, Dr. Anthony Gonzalez, and Dr. Kusha Haraksingh, and all members of the audience, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and members of the U.W.I community. Thank you very much for coming and contributing to this discussion this afternoon that we hope will be a very rich exchange of views. Now, I must tell you that this particular event has been very long in the making. This book actually came out just over a year ago, but Dr. Montut, one of the two editors, was absent on sabbatical, and it was also very difficult to coordinate with the ACP Secretariat and with the co-editor from the Center for Conflict Resolution, the partners involved in its production. And so a lot of time has passed. We are very happy that we are finally having the opportunity both to launch this very important text and also to have a healthy exchange of views about the present state of EU-Caribbean relations and also relations among the members of the ACP partnership. Now, I just want to say my own particular words of congratulations to the editors and to the authors of this text. The book is a significant achievement. This text, the ACP group and the EU development partnership, beyond the North-South debate. It's a significant achievement because it is written primarily from the perspective of the regions and the countries and the academics of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states. It is not essentially a European Union perspective, although there are European perspectives in the book, but it is a pronouncement on the state of ACP EU relations, development partnership relations, from the perspectives of the ACP countries. It provides substantial historical material for research and analysis, and it also provides grist for the mill at this turning point, crucial turning point, in the European and ACP relationship as the Cotonou Partnership Agreement comes to an end next year in 2020, February 2020, exactly 1 year from today. There are valuable nuggets of insight into the future, not only of European Union and Caribbean relations, but significantly into the future prospects for intra-ACP relations after 45 years of interrelating via our networks with the European Union. The Caribbean has managed during these years to build modest but promising relations with Pacific small island developing states, particularly in the areas of ocean governance and climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building. And we have ongoing and very vibrant relations with the various regions of Africa. It is to be hoped that Such links will not gradually wither post-Cotonou, but will instead take on a new lease of life. It should be noted that both regions, like ourselves, are substantial members of the Commonwealth. We hope that the new lease of life will lead to new directions based on the sustainable development visions and efforts for our respective regions and countries. Now, all these endeavors have to be supported by committed and meticulous scholarship in the ACP countries. And I am personally very proud that academics associated with the U.W.I, and especially with this institute, have been key partners in the endeavor of producing this text. Congratulations to Dr. Montoute, Dr. Gonzalez, and Professor Norman Gervin of blessed memory. Also to Dr. Kudrat Virk, Ambassador P.I. Gomes, and all the other contributors to the ACP group and to the EU Development Partnership beyond the North-South debate. Without any further ado, I would like to declare this seminar open, and it is my pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, who is going to do a review of the text, Dr. Kusha Harak Singh. Dr. Kusha Harak Singh is an honorary consultant in the Office of the Vice Chancellery at the U.W.I. He's a graduate of the London School of Oriental and African Studies, a barrister of Lincoln's Inn, and an attorney at law. He has been, at various periods, chairman of the Institute of African and Asian Studies, head of the Department of History, and the founding dean of the Faculty of Law here at St. Augustine. And he is a much appreciated fellow of the Institute of International Relations. He has also been in the past visiting fellow at the Center for Caribbean Studies, University of Warwick, and a senior Fulbright fellow at Harvard University. He has served as a CARICOM mediator and conciliator, and he was the founding chairman and commissioner of the CARICOM Competition Commission, also chair of the Sugar Association of the Caribbean, on whose behalf he participated in the negotiations that led to the Cotonou Partnership Agreement. For the Economic Partnership Agreement negotiations, he was the lead CARIFORUM negotiator on legal and institutional issues, dispute settlement, and development cooperation. Dr. Kusha Harak Singh, over to you.
Thank you, Director, for your kind remarks and also for doing half of my job for me by introducing the publication. I want to thank the Institute for giving me this opportunity, and also Dr. Montoute for sharing my views on this very thoughtful and brave publication on the ACP and the EU relations. In what I have to say, briefly, I will divide my remarks into three areas. Firstly, I will say something about the main themes of the book. Secondly, with students in mind, I will make some pedagogical remarks on the treatment of those themes and of the development of the book itself. And thirdly, I will remark on some policy issues which are raised in the book with practitioners in mind. But first, some introductory remarks. I think I need to disclose that at the moment, I'm engaged with the ACP Secretariat as an advisor on the revision of the Georgetown Agreement, which is a constituent document for the ACP, and I'm also advising on the negotiations, on the negotiating mandate of the ACP countries. So I'm not exactly a disinterested observer in these proceedings, but this is partly an academic exercise, and it is in that spirit that I will make my remarks. I need to say that the text, which is extremely brave because it is crafted at a time when the sands are shifting, even as one writes, is a text that reminds me of a quote that I recently heard in the Brexit debate, that the past is history, the future is a mystery, and today is a gift, which is why it's called the present. That last part is slightly theological, so we'll leave that aside. But this book deals both with history and the future, and it's a brave attempt at charting what is likely to happen. So congratulations for bravery, especially in the context of all the shifting sands that we are dealing with. For even as we speak today, the African Union heads are meeting in Addis Ababa, and I'm sure if not on the formal agenda, at least in the conversations on the corridors, they will be taking some positions which have profound implications for the future of African relations with Europe and by extension for the future of the ACP itself. We also had yesterday a decision of the European Competition Commission on a merger between Siemens and Alstom, which the European Commission refused to agree with and blocked it. What was important was the political response to that, with France saying we should overhaul all of Europe's competition laws, with Germany saying we will now take ownership of part ownership of German companies to prevent takeovers by foreign multinationals, and everybody talking about revisiting free trade and the implications of unbridled free trade and how to position oneself to deal especially with China. So a lot of what lies at the core of the ACP-EU relations are being questioned even in the core of the relations, which is in Europe itself. So we also had this week the EU-Japan agreement, which is a large free trade agreement, which raises questions that the book itself raises about ACP relations in the wider context of international affairs. And I haven't even mentioned Brexit. So all of these things are happening even as we have to consider the contents of this book. I also need to congratulate the editors on a point that the director made, which is balancing the perspectives. Very often when we read these kinds of publications, we get a view from Europe with little, maybe peripheral reference to the views of people in the wider ACP region. But the book solves that problem by having contributors from different parts of the world, from the Pacific, from the Caribbean, from Africa, and doing so in a more balanced way than the ACP itself, because the ACP really has difficulty trying to balance and coordinate its responses to many issues. The book is also very important for its footnoting and referencing. The references are very detailed. The footnotes in particular are very useful. And this is important, especially as the literature in this area is growing by leaps and bounds, even as we speak. So it's important to have the way of going back to the sources presented in the book. The main themes in this book are expertly summarized in a well-crafted conclusion. One of the important issues that I see is the question of asymmetry and how to handle asymmetry, an important issue in the book. The second one is how to keep the focus on development. The third one is how to conceptualize the political dimension, which deals with the issue of good governance. The fourth one, to deal with new challenges in security and migration policy. And the fifth one, how to buttress ACP relevance in a changing world. Now, all of these themes are discussed in the book. On some of them, I have my own views. For example, on asymmetry, one of the questions that always comes up is, how can we deal with the EU, which is so much more powerful than us, where the EU always has its own internal machinations to deal with us, how we have to suspect them, how they're out for their own good and not our good. and how they narrow our room for maneuver or degrees of freedom. We have to move from simply complaining and try to look at our own response and how we can craft our own response. This we did in the EPA on the question of asymmetry, where we calibrated what we called a kind of geometrical reciprocity as opposed to total reciprocity, where we looked at the time frame for WTO compatibility and the notion of substantially all trade, which we were able to expand in a way that had not been done before. On the question of negotiating when the power relations are asymmetrical, I've said before in other forums that what we need to do is to try to find out what the other side needs, what they desire very earnestly, and try to use that for our own advantages to neutralize the question of power relations. In keeping the focus on development as a tool, we need to, and we have successfully been able to do it so far, we need to displace the idea of regional integration as equal to development, which is a European idea, and to see it as a tool for development rather than as an end in itself. And in financing, well, here we have to somehow find a way of not directing, but redirecting the idea that we in the ACP are beggars, always asking for development money, and find a way of asking without seeming to beg, I guess, is the way to do it. So to handle the financing question, we need also to handle the kind of arguments that the European Union puts on the table. They say that this money that we are giving you is money from our own taxpayers, and that our taxpayers have certain demands. And those are the demands that lead to the debate about good governance, about gender equality, about absence of capital punishment, about treatment of deprived areas and so on. And they put that forward as not something that they themselves are demanding, but the people who give them the money to give us are demanding. So those are things that we have to find a way to deal with. And of course, as just mentioned, the Japan agreement to deal with the ACP, the relevance of the ACP in a changing world. Now, those of you who read the book will find these themes elaborated on in the book, and I'm sure you'll find the discussion very fruitful and informative. Now, the pedagogical issues, just briefly, I just want to mention. This relates to the writing of contemporary history in a situation where the pace of events is bewildering and where the actors are many. You have heard that I started off life in African and Asian studies, which was an area studies operation. Because the university at that time did not, well, felt that people should move to more mainstream disciplines. Me and my colleague, one of whom worked here in international relations, Dr. Fitzbertis, were transferred to history, where we quickly learned about the lines of the debate on writing contemporary history. Some of our colleagues didn't think that that was a subject at all, that's something you should be engaged in. And when I moved to be the Dean of Law, I was confirmed in some of the implications of that debate, when in trying to fund the law library, I discovered that although it's very expensive, a good law book only lasts for like 18 months, because after that it becomes irrelevant. So looking at contemporary history, it's not an easy exercise. There are some things that you have as students to be careful about. The first one is the role of assumptions, because if your study is based on assumptions and these later prove to be unfounded or they don't come true, then they have implications for your entire study. But more importantly, I think the nature of evidence is something that requires attention. In this book and in many other writings on contemporary matters, you sometimes find credentials parading as evidence. That is to say, you find the author saying, this expert has said so and so, as if the expert itself or the expertise itself is evidence. But credentials is not evidence. And sometimes too you find the expert predicting, prophesying, but prophecy is not evidence. So how does one handle that then? The crucial question of evidence, which might only be partially available and difficult to test without distance, becomes extremely important. But here in international relations, there's something also that's very important. When I was negotiating on legal issues, the question that always emerges is how do you handle and settle a dispute when it comes up? And sometimes the dispute, according to the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, can be resolved if there is a kind of uncertainty by what's called the travaux préparatoires, the documents and notes which were kept when the treaty was being negotiated. Very often, these are not in our possession. They might be in the possession of Europe or somebody else at the UN or somewhere. So keeping notes and fixing what has happened at a given time becomes very important. And in that sense, then, this book is useful because it tries to paint a picture at the present time of what is happening and how people are thinking, and might give some kind of insight into what various clauses in various treaties might or might not mean. So that is the question of evidence. Sometimes what you take as evidence later on proves to be, well, I think the contemporary phrase is a fiction of some kind. So fake news. So sometimes the evidence is only discernible with the passage of time. So writing about what's happening at the moment must give you some pause about how you handle what is called evidence. And also, what does this writing contemporaneously mean for the notion of a juncture or a turning point? The editors in this book say that this is one of the rationales for having the book, because we are at a turning point. But turning points, or the ACP itself has been at many turning points. At the end of Lomé, the inauguration of the WTO, the Treaty of Lisbon, the Everything But Arms Treaty. Each one of these had severe implications for the ACP as a whole, and arguably can be considered a juncture, a critical juncture, or a turning point. One needs to be a little more explicit and a little more discerning about what exactly is a turning point. Now, in dealing with the policy issues, there is a summary in the concluding chapter on what are the major policy issues. Right now, we have, as I mentioned at the beginning, the revision of the Georgetown Agreement. We also have the ongoing negotiations with the ACP and Europe. I think the book provides a useful framework for understanding these issues, both in an academic sense, as in the treatment of the historical background of Lomé, and in a practical sense, as illuminated, for example, by the chapter on the working of the ACP Committee of Ambassadors, where a lot of the technical work for the negotiations is taking place. But there are some things which I thought might be the subject of another book, or maybe this book could have treated in a perhaps a more exhaustive way. The first one is the role of the private sector. I think that could have merited some greater treatment, because in the question of development, the role of the private sector is obviously crucial. When the EPA was being negotiated, even when Cotonou was being negotiated, there was a lot of talk about what was called a private sector chapter. Some kind of idea that there must be some chapter specially designated for the private sector. That did not come to pass, but in between the lines of these various agreements, there are references to the role of the private sector and what they must or must not do. Because at the end of the day, the development takes place by the actors on the scene, by the private sector. This reminds me of something that I always keep at the back of my head. I call it the Napoleon dilemma. Some of you might remember that he has a famous line in the middle passage where he says, "Nothing was ever produced or created here." A line for which he was pilloried, and it made him reluctant to visit the Caribbean again. because people said, how could you say that nothing was created here? We have Carnival, we have Calypso, we have all these other things that we have created. But the line, the context of the line was where he said, first he asked a question, what or who are our heroes? And the answer was, our heroes are cricketers who take to drink, or island scholarship winners who go mad. He's probably talking about his own uncle. The second line was, the second question, and who are our most successful people? And the answer was, commission agents, people who buy and sell. And then came the line, nothing was ever produced or created here. So one of the things which the EPA tried to do was to tackle this problem, to say the markets are going to be opened for everything that we can create, without quota and without duty. Now the question is, who is going to create it? And the answer is that we have yet to find out who will create the things to sell in this market opportunity. So that private sector becomes extremely important. In preparation for this, I was reminded of a company that I've spoken about here at IR called Santander, which is a company owned by two Nicaraguan or Colombian brothers who flew over Belize, saw this wide expanse of land, and decided to come and set up a sugar plantation. But when you read their company's website, they explain why they did this. And they did this because they were forum shopping. They looked at the trade agreements that CARICOM has, in CARICOM itself, and with the EU. And their website says explicitly, because it asks the question, why Belize? And then it answers, because of the trade agreements which Belize has, that enables us to sell however much sugar we can produce, duty-free, quota-free, to Europe. We have opportunities to take advantage of, and some explanation of why the private sector has been unable to do this might have been welcome in a publication like this kind, because at the end of the day, that's where the engine room is for the notion of development. So I did congratulate the editors on this book. I think it's brave, I think it's thoughtful, I think it's comprehensive. But I might say that I would have liked to hear some more about how the publication came about, how the authors of the various chapters were selected, whether there were any presumptive contributors who were ignored or not chosen, and if so, why, and whether the authors of the various chapters had a chance to see the other chapters in draft before they concluded their chapters, so that there could have been a kind of internal debate among themselves before the final publication of the book. And I thought also about the subtitle, which says Beyond the North-South Debate, and I was wondering exactly how it came about and how appropriate that is. My final recommendation, especially as one of the editors, is from South Africa, and this is a recommendation not for the book, but maybe for the Institute as a whole, is that we need to further our engagement with scholars and academics and practitioners in South Africa, especially, I would say, with the South African Constitutional Court and their thinking and their deliberations and judgments. So with that, I just want to thank again the editor, Dr. Montoute, and the Institute for this opportunity. And I hope I've given you a useful insight into the book, and as reviewers have to do, kind of encourage you to read it yourself and to perhaps buy it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harak Singh. Never can you be accused of not raising new questions and challenging us to think more creatively about what is in front of us. Now, you ended on a note that I hope that our next speaker, Dr. Anita Montoute, will take up, in that I imagine that she is well placed to give some insight into questions about the authors and the subtitle of the book and things like that. And so at this point in time, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anita Montoute, who is one of the two editors and a co-author of this text. Dr. Montoute holds a PhD and a postgraduate diploma from this institute. She also did her undergraduate studies in history at the University of the West Indies. Now she has worked for several years as a lecturer here at the Institute of International Relations, but she has also been a research fellow at the European Center for Development and Policy Management in Maastricht in the Netherlands for a while. And her research interests include civil society, ACP EU relations, and her most recent area of focus concerns emerging powers in the global political economy, and of course their activities in the Caribbean. So Dr. Montoute, welcome to the podium, and we look forward to hearing your perspectives on the book.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Deep, deep thanks to the panel, in particular those who are from overseas. It's good to see you again. As Professor Byron said, I worked at the ECDPM for a while, and thanks to Ambassador Matherin for making time to be with us this afternoon. Now, what I'm going to do, I want you to buy the book, and a lot has been said about the content of the book. So I'm not going to go into the substance beyond what the reviewer has asked me to comment on. That is the point he made about the private sector and the rationale for the subtitle of the book, which I will do in the end. But I will start by saying thank you very much, Dr. Harrison. As always, very insightful and greatly appreciated. As I said before, I will speak at the end on the point on the private sector and the subtitle. But first, let me start by saying that this book is the outcome of a very long journey, as Dr. Professor Byron said. The book project came out of a research seminar convened by the Center for Conflict Resolution in South Africa in 2014. And I'm very happy. I think that we have representatives from the South African High Commission here today, I think. The Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town, South Africa, convened a seminar with about 30 participants, including leading policymakers such as chief EPA negotiators and the current Secretary General of the ACP, as well as scholars and civil society actors. The aim was to assess the nature of the relationship between the ACP group and the EU, and the potential for their further strategic engagement as the final 5-year review of the Cotonou Agreement of 2000 between the two sides approached in 2015. The seminar also sought to support the ACP group's institutional reform efforts and the broadening of future relations with new non-European partners such as China, Brazil, India, and Russia. And that points to what I'm going to say in the end about the subtitle, Beyond the North-South Debate. Discussions focused on 7 key themes: the ACP-EU historical and trade partnership relationship, the past, present, and future of this relationship, the impact of the economic partnership agreements, the EPAs, South Africa's engagement with the ACP and the EU, the security dimension of the ACP-EU relationship, comparative regional integration in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and geopolitics and migration. I would like to recognize Professor Adekeye Adebajo, who was the director of the CCR at the time, and now professor and director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, for having the foresight to convene the seminar and to discuss this very important issue. Professor Ade invited the late Professor Norman Govan, to attend the seminar, but Professor Govan was unable to attend. In light of my work at the ECDPM at the time, the ECDPM being a research and policy-oriented organization working on ACP, EU, and related matters, Professor Govan suggested to Professor Ade that we would write the paper jointly, and I would attend as a substitute. Professor Govan and I wrote the joint paper. We have the chapter here on the Caribbean and ACP-EU relations. But in the end, I was unable to attend the seminar. I won't tell you why. Something went terribly wrong, and I was not able to attend the seminar. But I could tell you in private subsequently, if anybody's interested. We submitted the paper to the seminar. It was presented by Ambassador Patrick Gomes, the Secretary General of the ACP Group of States, who also has a chapter in this publication, as has been mentioned previously. Subsequently, Professor Ade asked me to be the editor along with Dr. Kudrak Virk, who was working at the CCR at the time, the Center for Conflict Resolution. But not every chapter in the book came out of the presentations at the conference. Some were later commissioned to fill existing gaps. For example, the chapters on diasporas and development by Keith Nurse and Ramona Ruggieri, the CARIFORM Economic Partnership Agreement by Dr. Peter Gonzalez, and Migration by Anna Noll, who's from the ECDPM in Maastricht in the Netherlands. We had to drop one of the original chapters for a specific reason that I won't go into right now, but I really wanted to address that particular point about how we decided on the chapters. There was one particular chapter on migration that we had to drop out, and then we got another one to be in the book. The editors decided on the internal coherence of the book. My co-editor and myself, we had the task of streamlining the chapters and removing unnecessary overlapping content and duplications in the book, which tends to happen when you are writing on an area where the issues are so interrelated. That happens. So we had to do a lot of streamlining, chopping, rearranging. We did this throughout the editing process, but particularly for the chapters on migration and diaspora and development, not only because they had not seen each other's papers, but also because the two areas are so closely related. In that case, we shared the migration paper with the authors on diaspora and development to illustrate our point. This was the only paper which we shared, but many of the authors would have heard each other's presentation at the seminar and would have engaged in debate at that particular forum. Going back to the point on the private sector, I do agree that non-state actors are important to the ACP-EU relationship and could have been given greater prominence in this work. In fact, one of the reviewers had suggested more on the role of civil society in the book, and we sought to address this in the best way that we could. Unfortunately, so Dr. Harrison, you're definitely not alone on that point. Unfortunately, we had gone the route of submitting of submitting a proposal with 1 or 2 chapters in the process of seeking a book contract, in which case these actors could possibly have been included as a standalone chapter in the book. What we did was to complete and submit the entire manuscript, having subjected all the chapters to a lengthy internal review and editing process. If we were to include a chapter or chapters on the private sector or the other non-state actors, it meant that new authors would have had to be recruited and their papers would have had to go through both internal and external blind peer review. This would have resulted in the project being significantly delayed. So what we did was to weave the civil society aspects into the text, hence the reason their role and that of the private sector is not as prominent as it should be in the book. I do, however, acknowledge the importance of these actors in the ACP-EU relationship and in trade policy decision-making more broadly. In fact, while I was at the ECDPM, I wrote a discussion paper titled Civil Society Participation, EPA Implementation, How to Make the EPA Joint CARIFORM EC Consultative Committee work effectively. And there are details in this article about tracing the history of civil society participation, EU ACP Development Cooperation. The significance of the private sector and civil society, and I put civil society in bracket, continues to be important in the context of the post-Cotonou discussions. In November 2018, the ACP Secretariat, in collaboration with Business ACP, convened an ACP private sector consultation on the post-Cotonou negotiations in Barbados, with the aim of exploring, assessing and formulating relevant ACP private sector needs, demands, and opportunities with a view to providing inputs into the post-Cotonou negotiating process. The key points which emerged were that the post-Cotonou agreement should A, contribute to the industrial transformation of ACP countries through the establishment of industrial parks, design studios and excellence centers. B, attract domestic and foreign investment in air, sea, and land connectivity infrastructure and services that facilitate intra-ACP trade. And C, enhance trade by addressing non-tariff measures and promoting value addition. Critical views on the role of this private sector in the post-Cotonou process acknowledge that while the private sector is important to the development process, the private sector should only be supported in a manner to fight against poverty, injustice, inequalities, poor labor standards, and to promote dignity and sustainable development. Importantly, the support should focus on local and small-scale entrepreneurs in ACP countries, comprising of different actors, including cooperatives and small-scale farmers. Concerning the North-South debate, as a subtitle, as I mentioned previously, we wanted to move beyond discussing the ACP-EU relationship in terms of simply developed partners and underdeveloped or developing partners, and to include the issues of the emerging economies and the rising powers, which was an important issue in the emerging global environment. So the chapter on the emerging economies by my co-editor in the book was what that informed, that the relationship should be diversified beyond the ACP and the EU to other partners that were already having great impact and already been engaged with the ACP sub-regions. In addition to my gratitude to Professor Ade and the entire team at the Center of Conflict Resolution, in closing, I would like to thank the contributors who provided rich analyses and who were very patient with us through the editing process. I would also like to thank the reviewers for their comments. The comments were very useful for the final product that you see here today if you were to purchase a copy of the book. I also wish to thank Dr. Patrick Gomes, the ACP Secretary General, who was very enthusiastic about the project from the beginning. In fact, he launched the publication at the ACP Secretariat in Brussels immediately after it was released. My deepest thanks to my co-editor, Dr. Kudrak Verg. Unfortunately, she was not able to participate in this event, but who was an excellent co-editor and a wonderful collaborator. And we have the opportunity, Dr. Harrison, I want to just inform you that we are continuing to collaborate with her on a current book project that we are working on. Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez, Georgina, and Debbie Mohammed. She is part of this project, not substantively, but we are working with her on this project. I wish to thank also the persons who provided endorsements for the book. Professor Marie Gilbert, Visiting Fellow, Center for European and International Studies Research, University of Portsmouth, UK. Professor Jessica Byron Reed, Director of the Institute of International Relations, the University of the West Indies St. Augustine Campus, Trinidad and Tobago, and His Excellency Carrie, I pronounced this before and now I'm stumbling on it, Ambassador of Namibia to Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and the EU. Finally, thank you, Professor Byron, for insisting that I should launch this book here, and it was definitely timely to do so. I'm glad that we are doing it today. I leave the vote of thanks now for this event to Ms. Asabi Rawlings to do so at the very end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mantoot. Dr. Mantoot was a bit too modest to mention it, but there are, in fact, a very limited number of texts, of copies of the book, which are at the back. They are available for purchase. And, of course, you have at least two of the authors here present today who might be available to autograph those books, should you be in a position to make a purchase today. So please remember that we do have some texts available on the table at the side. I think that Dr. Mantoot has segued very well into the contribution from our next speaker, Mr. Hiet Laporte. Both Dr. Harak Singh and Dr. Mantoot have referred to the post-Cotonou negotiations, which are well in train at the moment. And welcome, Mr. Laporte. It's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon.
Hello.
Again.
Yeah.
Hello. Mr. Geert Laporte is the Deputy Director of the European Center for Development Policy Management, ECDPM. This is a think and do tank. It's based in Maastricht in the Netherlands, and it also has, of course, it has a presence in Brussels. It specializes in looking at European Union external action and development with a particular focus on Africa and the group of ACP countries. Mr. Laporte is responsible for a wide range of themes covered by the ECDPM. The ECDPM's relations with EU institutions, with EU presidencies of the Council and EU member states, the African Union, the African regional economic communities, the ACP institutions, and a broad network of global institutions and non-governmental organizations. He has been involved in extensive policy-relevant research and analysis, the facilitation of policy dialogue and evaluation. Those of you who visit the ECDPM's website would have been privileged to read a lot of what Geert Laporte has produced over the last few years, and to be able to use that analysis in your own work. Geert Laporte holds degrees in history and in development studies with specialization in public administration from the University of Ghent in Belgium. We welcome you, Mr. Laporte.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's a real pleasure to be connected with IIR. I've been there a few times in the past, and I still have a lot of friends over there. I'm particularly happy that also Peter Gonzalez will be there. Kusha has already spoken. Anita was with us several years ago. So that's really a real pleasure to participate in this session. I think you said it already from the very beginning that we are indeed a think and do tank. And the do aspect of our work means that we always start to look more and more from practice. We fully concord and agree with all those who say that ACP EU and that Cotonou is a model type of agreement on paper. But we also want to look at the practice. And once you look at the practice, once you're collecting evidence, you discover sometimes a different reality. And maybe that's the type of input that I would like to make to this discussion. Let me first say a few words about the negotiation and the ongoing negotiating process. And then secondly, look into the doubts that we have developed about this type of agreement for the future. Thirdly, look at why change is so difficult. And then fourthly, try to explore what should be done to make this a more adapted type of partnership, including for the Caribbean, that is sometimes the forgotten region together with the Pacific, because it's absolutely correct that Europe is focusing very much these days on Europe-Africa, and that the Caribbean and the Pacific is sometimes lost in the type of discussions that are taking place at the level of the European Union. Maybe one more caveat: we are a fully independent foundation. Anita knows this very well. And we sometimes have major problems with the Commission and with several EU member states when we present our analysis. So you will not find any type of bias in favor of the European negotiating parties, nor of the ACP negotiating parties with whom we have had excellent relations. But of course, if you say certain things, and if you try to build evidence-based analysis, it's not always evident that the various parties appreciate the type of work that we are producing. But now, going back to the negotiating mandate, it was in 2011 that Ambassador Gunnessy, the ambassador of Mauritius, came to ECDPM and he was heading a group on future perspectives of the ACP group. The ACP was much more advanced at that time than the European Union. Already in 2011, a reflection was starting up at the level of the ambassadors on the future of the ACP group. And Ambassador Gunassi of Mauritius, he was very clear. He said there is a need to change the role of the ACP group, or otherwise our relevance will be threatened in this rapidly changing global world. And this was a very promising start of the post-Cotonou debate. Now we are almost 8 years later. And when I look at the negotiating mandates of both parties, and we analyze these two negotiating mandates, both the ACP mandate and the European Union mandate, I don't see this urgency and this desire that was expressed already in 2011 to fundamentally revive or revise this ACP-EU cooperation. Yes, there is in the ACP mandate recognition of major transformations in the world. Yes, there is a kind of call to reassess this type of cooperation agreement. But then when I look at the ambitions that are spelled out, making the ACP the leading transcontinental organization in the world, then I start to have a bit of doubts. And then I start to say, is this realistic? Can we really dream of an ACP group that could have been very relevant, let's say in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, even up to 2000, you could say, but can we really dream that a group that is composed of the last European colonies, that does not even include the whole of Africa, because North Africa is not part of the group, that is as diverse as the Bahamas and Burkina Faso, Somalia, can we really assume that this group can become a real global player that will change our global world in a number of respects? We have some doubts about that. We think that this is wishful thinking and that this is not substantiated by factual evidence. And what we have seen is that on the European side, there was a kind of divide in the run-up to the negotiations between those member states who wanted to continue with this type of cooperation, backed by the Development Directorate of the European Commission, and those countries who felt that it is time to move into agreements with more homogeneous groupings of countries that share strong common interests, be it on thematic issues, for example, small island development states, or be it on geographic criteria, like, for example, the African Union, which is already taking the lead in a number of areas where the ACP has no proven competence or where the ACP is not at all a relevant player. I'm mentioning here, for example, peace and security in Africa, migration issues, even trade issues, which are now more and more regionalized through the EPA process and also through the continental free trade area in Africa. Also, this is not any longer what I would call a kind of responsibility of the ACP group. So the ACP has lost its political relevance because it is not really involved in the real political dialogue that matters. Migration, peace and security, but it is also not any longer involved in the economic dialogue, because there it are the RECs, the regional economic communities, that play a key role. So what is left is a kind of development instrument. ACP is a kind of development type of tool through which quite a lot of substantial funding is distributed. We are talking about more than 30 billion euros over a period of 7 years. And this is in fact, I would say, a very worrying trend. And the privileged relationship between the ACP and the European Union, the flagship status of which we always talked 20, 30 years back, does not exist anymore. And I think we need to be very realistic that the ACP will not be the platform that will change the UN system. It will never become a leading transcontinental organization. We may dream about this, but it won't happen. And this is based on political economy evidence, and we should be more realistic and recognize that there is a lack of cohesion in the ACP group, and that the bargaining power of the ACP is not growing, is not increasing. On the contrary, it is more and more losing impact. And then, of course, this is an element that brings me to what we should do if we know that this is a bit of an outdated recipe with limited effectiveness. And that this is also not serving at this very moment a European Union that is in shambles, that is in deep trouble, as you know, with Brexit, with populism rising in many countries, with an aging population, with a lack of coherence in foreign policy tools at this moment, because Europe is very risk averse and Europe is very much afraid to engage in new types of cooperation. Well, if you look at all this, we end up with very hybrid types of scenarios. And this is what the European Union is now trying to push in its negotiating mandate. It recognizes the regional dynamics, but at the same time, it wants to preserve the ACP foundation and kind of ACP umbrella. And this is the type of negotiating structure that Europe has proposed. So we should first negotiate, and this process is ongoing, an umbrella, a kind of foundation where we have all types of very important principles, where we discuss the acquis of the Cotonou agreements of the ACP-EU cooperation, and predictable aid, co-management issues, political dialogue, joint institutions. But then the center of gravity, according to the European mandate, should be with the regions. And the regional pillars, an EU Africa, an EU Caribbean, and an EU Pacific regional agreement should be the center of gravity of the future post-Cotonou cooperation. When we look at this, this is the mandate of the EU, we see that this is still having a lot of hurdles to be put in practice. And one of the problems that we have encountered is that the African individual member states, they, to some extent, are afraid to entrust more responsibilities and to hand over sovereignty to the African Union. So they prefer to work with an ACP and an ACP secretariat, ACP Committee of Ambassadors in Brussels, rather than working with their regional organizations. However, when you look at the reality again, the African Union has more political traction. There is a summit of the African Union. All heads of state of Africa will be there. When the ACP organizes a summit, the last summit in Papua New Guinea, there was one African head of state, Mr. Mugabe. Most of the other participants were ambassadors from Brussels. So it shows that the political traction of the African Union is stronger, yet African states are afraid to hand over responsibility and sovereignty to the regional level. And I suspect that something similar is happening in the Caribbean, that we also witness there a fear of individual member states to hand over responsibilities to CARICOM, to CARIFORUM. And this creates, of course, also problems for this regional pillar that still needs to be negotiated, regional pillar Caribbean European Union. Now we analyzed why it is so difficult to change. What is the main reason why different parties want to stick to a kind of, call it model on paper that in practice does not really work? Why is it that we want to preserve this and even expand roles and mandates of this ACP, even if we know that it has not worked according to what its intentions were? And then we come to the conclusion that 44 years of ACP-EU cooperation have created a lot of institutions with a lot of vested interests. You have a whole range of people who are part of this ACP EU system, and they are very much concerned to keep this system alive. And this is both the case with ACP individuals and ACP institutions and joint institutions as it is with European institutions. DEFCO, the Directorate General for Development in the European Commission, wants to preserve ACP at all price. Why? Because it allows them to manage substantial funds, over 30 billion euros, as I just said, and this gives them a certain power, a certain influence. But there are other actors who, like the European External Action Service, who would prefer to move away from ACP. And in the global strategy of Mrs. Mogherini, the High Representative for European foreign policy, there is not even mention of ACP in her strategy. So it shows that at other levels, ACP is not really taken seriously anymore. And this shows that it is difficult to really move on in this debate. You have on the one hand side strong vested interests, and on the other hand, there is not yet a newly born type of maybe better arrangement. And in a risk-averse context, nobody wants to bring about change to existing recipes that exist already for 43 years. Let me just conclude with a few suggestions as to what could bring the future. And I don't know the Caribbean well enough, but I hope that you will complement some of the suggestions that I would like to make. I think that we need to move, and that is the future, to more genuine continental and regional perspectives. This is already happening in a number of respects on trade issues, but it should become more and more the case, because in geographic homogeneous regions, you have more potential to bring about leverage in negotiations with the European Union than if you are sitting together with 79 countries in a very diverse type of arrangement where the common interest is very small, is very limited. There was a common interest, I fully agree, 30 years back, but now it's very difficult to justify, as I said earlier, why certain countries in the Caribbean, but also in Africa, should have a strong common link. And we looked into that. Trade between Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific is very limited. There is a major intra-ACP envelope in the Cotonou Agreement, and this is used for all types of gatherings and events. But if you look at private sector interests between the A, the C, and the P, this is very limited, very limited. So it shows that it is probably better to go with groupings that show more cohesion. Secondly, I think, as Anita also said, we have been witnessing a very strong state-to-state type of cooperation. Negotiations led by ambassadors, by high-level officials, quite normal if you have an international agreement. But there's a lot of talk in Cotonou about non-state actors, youth. But if you look at the practice, and we looked into that practice, particularly in Africa, this is a closed shop for all these new generations of young people who have big ambitions, who have great ideas in Africa, and they can't access this cooperation because in authoritarian states, national authorizing officers are not willing to share the resources with their civil society because the civil society is opposition. That's not what they want. So in fact, we have a reverse effect as to what Cotonou intended to realize. Opening up to civil society is not taking place in most parts of Africa. I can't judge for the Caribbean. I leave it to you to complement that remark. Third remark, I think we need to move for any new type of agreement to a far less heavy institutional framework. This framework is very heavy, very heavy. We have Council of Ministers, we have Committee of Ambassadors, we have joint parliamentary assemblies, you have a whole range of joint institutions. And this makes it sometimes extremely heavy. And I'm wondering why an ACP Council of Ministers that discusses the rise of sea levels, climate change in small island states, why you need to have landlocked countries of Africa on board in these discussions. Why should the Caribbean and the Pacific sit around the table when a discussion is taking place about Boko Haram in Nigeria and peace and security matters in Mali? Is this really needed to sit with 79 countries all the time together to discuss these matters? So let's maybe also there reflect on how to make this framework much more practical and less heavy. And then, of course, I think it's important as a clear sign that this relationship should not any longer be based on unilateral aid transfers. We are in the SDG era. This means that we are moving away from traditional North-South partnerships. North-South partnerships are not equal partnerships. They are not based on equal interests or on joint interests. They are based on unilateral relations, unilateral transfers from money from rich countries to poor countries or to so-called poor countries. I think it's important also there that the ACP at a certain moment tries to think of more creative ways of building these common interests. And this particularly goes for middle-income countries. Middle-income countries should abandon the aid dependency type of relationship. They should cooperate based on vested interest in areas such as climate, energy, knowledge exchange. That's where the future is. This is the type of new partnerships that we should be aiming for. Now, to conclude, where does the Caribbean stand? And I hear this a lot. We had a meeting last week in Brussels, and we were talking Europe-Africa. We were launching our challenges paper for Europe-Africa relations. And it was so nice to see that we had more Caribbean ambassadors participating than African ambassadors. It shows that the Caribbean always has been and still is a very committed region. You have very good and strong representatives in Europe, and they are very much committed. And I think what we need to do is to find ways to spell out these mutual interests better. And then I look at the Caribbean and the Pacific and the Indian Ocean countries who have been so influential in the COP in Paris when it was when we were talking climate. Sometimes it is said that it was the ACP that brokered this deal. No, it were the small island states. At the end, the ACP endorsed what was negotiated by AOSIS and SIDS, but it are these types of groupings where there is political traction that really can make a difference in this global world. But this requires, of course, regional leadership. It requires strong Caribbean regional organizations and individual member states that are willing to entrust responsibilities to the regional levels. So I think that there is the big challenge to build these joint interests. And I'm very much convinced that there are still joint interests between Europe and the Caribbean in many, many respects related to the SDG agenda, to the climate agenda, to the energy agenda, to the peace and security agenda to some extent as well. So there's a number of areas there where we need to spell this out better. I leave it here, and I'm, of course, very much looking forward to questions and answers and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Laporte. Very thought-provoking. And I think it's going to generate quite a bit of discussion as we get to that part of the afternoon's proceedings. At this point, I'd like to invite Dr. Anthony Gonzalez to the podium. Dr. Gonzalez is a graduate of U.W.I. and also of the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, where he did his international economics PhD. He has worked in all sorts of capacities here at the Institute, eventually becoming acting director on a number of occasions, and he is now an honorary senior fellow at the Institute. He worked as an industrial cooperation expert at the ACP Secretariat in Brussels. He also actively participated in the negotiation of the Second Lomé Convention, also worked as an investment promotion officer for the ACP EC Center for the Development of Industry. Dr. Gonzalez has served in several other capacities across the Caribbean, including being WTO Director and Representative of the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery in Geneva, Vice Chair of the Smaller Economies Consultative Group during the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas negotiations, Chair of the ACP High-Level Trade Advisory Group, President of the Trinidad and Tobago Economic Society, and consultant to a range of national, regional, and international organizations. Welcome, Dr. Gonzalez.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me thank you and Dr. Montour for inviting me. It's indeed a pleasure to be here, and I'm reminded somewhat of I think it was Ronald Reagan who, while extending his appreciation for the invitation to participate in a conference, he said that he was at a stage in life where he was happy to be anywhere, so that while I'm not feeling that I'm at that stage, I still do realize that the time is going by and probably that stage is coming. And why I say that is because today I look back and I see quite a few colleagues on the panel. There was Gert, who is a long associate who has been on this subject. Ambassador Mathurin has been a fellow traveler. I wouldn't say at what time she started because I don't want to reveal her age, but she's been with this subject for a long time. There's Kusha, of course, who has been with it. So that I still feel I'm in good company. I don't know how long we will be, we will continue with this, but indeed I'm happy to be here and to be among such colleagues. Let me say that I have not been able to prepare a presentation based on official documentation. As far as I'm aware, there are no official statements on the position of the Caribbean with respect to the future of Cotonou. I have identified what I believe to be the Caribbean interests, and so therefore this is a personal exercise. There are a number of things published by the ACP group. There are some things published by our friend P.I. Gomes, who I talk to from time to time, and we know him from the university here. And so on that basis, I have prepared this presentation. And what I really want to do is to really highlight what I believe to be some of the key interests of the Caribbean countries. I don't want to spend much time on the history or focus too much on the pros and cons of the Cotonou Agreement. I just want to, I think you guys give me a hand in terms of, I just want to in a kind of staccato fashion, just outline what I believe to be some of the main interests of the Caribbean. Before I do that, I want to just make one point, and if you could come up on this slide, just put it on for me, the next slide, or the one after this, press here, or this one? Yeah. Yes, I just want to highlight this particular slide. because I usually start from there. I think my first piece I wrote on Lomé probably started there somewhere in 1976. I've always believed that the ACP group was founded on these two basic criteria. The first was what the Europeans defined as the structural competitiveness criteria. That is to say, the Europeans looked at their colonies, that is those who had entered the European Union, the British and the French, and they looked at those that were at a certain level of structural competitiveness. And that could be easily defined. There are more elements to it, but it could essentially be defined as whether the level of human capital you had, what did you have, the level of technological development, what kind of infrastructure you have, your level of human capital and per capita income and so forth. What that did was to say, okay, these countries were at the lowest level of structural competitiveness, and therefore they were not competing with Europe. As a result, we can consider giving them a kind of special non-reciprocal relationship because they were basically not competitors. And this explains why countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and one or two others were not included in that group, right, when the British came in. There were others like Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, which we would say were more or less at the same level, but they were not included. And this brings me to the second criteria. The second criteria, which we don't talk too much, but which in my view is also very critical, has to do with the fact that these were colonies that were still close to Europe. That is, Europe was present around them, and Europe had a great geopolitical interest in them. They were European overseas territories in the Caribbean, Europe overseas territories in the Pacific and so forth. And Europe, of course, we know Europe's interest in Africa and Africa south of the Sahara. So that second criteria was what, in a way, determined who they were interested in giving this kind of special non-reciprocal preferences to at that point in time. And remember, that was the most advanced agreement you had, trade and financial cooperation agreement at the time when developing countries were talking about this new international economic order in 1975. It's pretty advanced. Even Yaoundé did not have a non-reciprocal trade arrangement. It was reciprocal. We came in and then it was changed to being a non-reciprocal arrangement. So that the reason, as I said, well, these countries were more or less regarded to be more or less at the bottom level of the scale, these former colonies, and that was the basis, more or less, for them coming together, the Caribbean actually taking that initiative and trying to promote negotiations as a group. And I think we must always remember that is, to some extent, the ACP is largely as a result of a Caribbean initiative, and the Caribbean believing that they needed to be part of a wider group in order to increase their strength in the international community. I remember the first commissioner, the first development commissioner, Mr. Sheso, he always used to say afterwards that this was a rare historical accident, how the Caribbean became part of the ACP group. But the Caribbean had it very clear in their mind what they wanted, and they negotiated the Georgetown Agreement to try to bring the ACP group together. Now, the reason I mention this is because I want to come back to this later, because the world has changed, and we all know that. A lot of things, there's no longer a north-south divide as we used to know it. There are a lot of emerging countries, and China is now today almost a superpower. And lots of changes. And has been a lot of differentiation and graduation. But what I want to say is that if you check, and this I have not been able to do, I would have liked to be able to do it for this exercise. If you check, for example, you may well find, and I go through the World Economic Forum's competitiveness index, the GIC, Global Competitiveness Index, GCI, and to a large extent, these 79 countries of the ACP are still basically at the bottom of the scale. There's not one of them that could be categorized as an innovating country, which is the highest level. Trinidad was some years ago put as in transition to an innovating country, but more or less it has not been able to make that transition. So there may be middle-income countries, some of them, but basically they're still striving to be proper, structurally competitive countries. And that's a point that I think is important to note, and why to some extent they still have that reason to want to bind together and to try to influence international events to some extent in their favor. Now, looking quickly at the Caribbean's interests, I would mention very quickly that there's, first of all, things that we are familiar with. There's development cooperation. We all know that. We have been graduated, at least quite a few of us have been graduated away from grant money and so on. But the development cooperation still remains very critical to us, particularly with respect to regional integration. We can hardly talk about regional integration in this area without the support of the EDF. Europeans have played a critical part, quite unlike the Americans, who don't care too much about regional integration here. Europeans have supported regional integration consistently over the years in terms of building the CSME, right down to the EPA Convention, and so forth. I spoke about this the last time when we had the seminar on the Noha Sinali auditorium, and I won't go into further into this. The development cooperation is a predictable arrangement. It constitutes a pretty large share of the European overall total budget, overall total aid budget, and it is organized in a way that is advanced in terms of the way aid is distribution, joint management, and in terms of its delivery. I agree with Gert. There's a lot of this has not worked in practice. You may find that the Europeans have been able to go around the joint arrangements and so forth and work directly with the countries and so forth, and some of that has worked. But the fact is a matter that these arrangements are there, and we just have to get them to work. There's trade asymmetry, which again, we have quite a bit of interest there. We have been able to negotiate an asymmetrical trade agreement. If you look at the provisions, and I have had the opportunity to study the various trade agreements in the WTO, and I think and Kusha could probably bear me out, the EPA is probably one of the most advanced in terms of its asymmetric nature. I think there are countries, for example, in the Caribbean here, which have still been able to keep 18, 20%. I think the OECS countries is something like 30% exclusion, which while under Article 24 of the WTO dealing with regional trade agreements, you just allowed something like about 10 or 12% maximum and so on. So that it's an arrangement which the Caribbean has been able to negotiate, which I think is basically in their interest, and it is not a purely fully reciprocal arrangement, which some of them feared they would have. The other things like investment and the EIB facility that they have access to and so on, and there's now talk a lot more about scientific and technical cooperation. We know a bit about Erasmus, but Europeans themselves are talking more about this. I have to move pretty quickly because there's a time constraint here, so just bear with me. Next, there's the question of political dialogue. Well, many in this part of the world would say, well, Caribbean is not, don't have the same types of problems as Africa, and we have, we don't have the same kind of terrorism at that same kind of level. We don't have the migration problem of that same level. We don't have all the conflicts that there is in Africa. And we don't have the same kind of human rights record and things like that. So that why do we have a political dialogue? Well, the dialogue is, I think, here is somewhat different. And this is why it has been regionalized. And I think in pointing out, in listening to Gert, I think we tend not to forget that the arrangement has evolved over these 40 years. It has not stayed the same. It has been regionalized in many ways. Today we deal with trade on a regional level. We deal with politics or the political dialogue on a regional level. We have a special dialogue under the joint Caribbean-EU partnership arrangement. We have a special political dialogue with Europeans. And there we talk about citizen security in the region, gang violence. We talk about drug trafficking in this region and so forth. Those are the things that are important to us. We don't talk about what's going on in Africa. We are not really, we can't get involved in that. That's for the Africans under the AU, the African Union and so forth to discuss, so that we are not part of that. And I believe that insofar as it links us with the outermost regions and overseas territories of the European Union, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Curacao, and all these other countries, it tends to bring us much more together, and it serves a very interesting purpose. So that that dialogue, I think, is something that we need to continue. We have an interest in this. And let me say, for instance, that it may seem, just as the African countries south of the Sahara don't want to keep all their eggs in one basket, and they want to diversify. There are problems between them and the countries north of the Sahara. There's always been that kind of divide and so forth. And they don't want to keep all their eggs in one basket, and they would like to keep a link with the Pacific and with the Caribbean. So we in the Caribbean, we also would like to keep a more diversified link with some of these other countries. We don't want to be trapped only exclusively here with the Latin American countries or with North America. We believe that it is somehow useful to have, it's a kind of insurance policy, if you wish, that we have friends in Africa or we have friends in the Pacific who we may need. We may not call on them every day, but we know that they are there and we can use them to some extent someday. I can see one or two countries in the Caribbean that have certain conflicts here with Latin America that wants to keep these Africans as friends, and they want to be close to them in that respect. So political dialogue is important for this region in that particular way. And then we have, I think I have the other interests, yes. We have other interests, yes, and let me quickly run through this. There's a question, and Gert mentioned it, about a greater role for the ACP as a tri-continental organization and more effective international political representation. Let me say that this is not really necessarily to make the ACP a global player. The ACP cannot be a global player because they're not really very strong, powerful countries and so forth. But this is to give them a better quality of representation internationally. I had the good fortune of working in the WTO at the ACP group in Geneva, and I saw them operate in terms of bringing the ACP countries together in the trade negotiation and the Doha trade negotiations. At that time, they were just starting. They weren't very fully recognized. But when I left there in 2006 or 2007, they had grown in strength, and they play a much more important role. I was told by my colleagues who went after that they were very instrumental in terms of the trade facilitation negotiation. So they have been growing, and they complement the work of other groupings. For example, they complement the work of IOSIS, they complement the work of the Small Economies Group in the WTO, and certainly I think that in terms of being able to partner with the Europeans, they do play an important role, or they could play an important role in terms of multilateralism. As a matter of fact, in listening to the start of the negotiations at the technical level, the chief European negotiator at the technical level, one of the main things he highlighted, and it struck me that I wasn't thinking so much about this, what he said is that in this age of declining multilateralism, the ACP could be a very useful partner with the Europeans. And he pointed out how important was the role of the ACP in getting the climate agreement in Paris, because they were able to link up with the ACP group to get some kind of majority vote in favor of climate change. I think Gert mentioned, well, you had IOSIS working there and so on. But you operate in these organizations in several groups. You may start in a small group, that is, we may start with CARICOM, then we operate in IOSIS, then we go to the ACP. You build, it's a building block exercise until you think it is. Now, the Europeans are looking at that and they're saying, look, we are 109 countries, and we can be a major force in terms of preserving multilateralism, and it can operate in several areas. For instance, they're pointing now to the Global Migration Compact, which is being discussed at the UN, and they believe that the ACP, together with the Europeans, can be a major force in trying to build a multilateral arrangement to deal with migration. And there are several other areas that we can talk about this. Next, we have the question of intra-ACP cooperation. I must admit that we have not been very successful on this. My few years in the ACP was spent actually sitting next to the colleague who worked on this for 5 years, and I know the frustrations about working with this. They tried with an ACP bank, they tried to promote trade, they tried several things. But they haven't given up, and I think that we cannot give up. We have to stay the course on this. And I think today now, as Africa has emerged, and what you're seeing now in Africa is the evolution of development taking place in several countries, and where you find links are being made with Africa which were not there before. We have in this country, for example, our biggest bank has bought a bank in Ghana. We have energy companies in this country that are doing a lot of interesting work in Africa today. We have professionals in this part of the world who are going to Africa and who are working in these places. So that I think we could look forward to a future where we could now build intra-ACP cooperation. And we could do it a lot better, for instance, today where South Africa is now part of the ACP group, where Cuba could be a part of the ACP group. I don't know what Cuba has done as yet to make that step. I was looking at a video, and I saw their plaque was there in the ACP room where the technical meeting. I don't know if they actually have decided. They now have an association agreement with the European Union and probably could become part of this arrangement. But that would certainly enhance our links with Africa. Cuba has very good relationship with Africa in terms of its historical role in Africa and so on, and it can provide quite a fair amount of technical assistance in terms to Africa in many areas. So I haven't given up on intra-ACP cooperation. I think it is an area that we need to put more emphasis on and build on it. Finally, a word about the institutional structure. This is the most sensitive part of all of this. Yes, the ACP has had problems. It is probably top-heavy. It is probably it is not recognizing the developments in regionalization and so forth enough. And one has to work out a kind of structure that is flexible enough to deal with this. And this is why I agree with this two-tiered structure that has been proposed. I said this at the Grenada consultations that they had, I think it was 2011 or 2013. I pointed out that we need to put up a structure that looks at this, and I'm happy to see that the Europeans have proposed a structure that deals with the foundation part, the all-ACP part, and the regional compact part. Now, that is not new, because in a sense, this is how the structure has been evolving. It has evolved more or less that way over the years, where, as I said, we deal with the political part, we deal with the trade part at the regional level, and then we have the all-ACP part where we deal with development cooperation. So essentially, I see the all-ACP part, which is the overarching kind of headquarters part, it will be dedicated to a lot of the common interests that we have with the Europeans on multilateralism. It could deal with more effective intra-ACP cooperation, more dynamic international representation, whether in the WTO or in climate change or wherever that takes place, they can play a much more active role. And certainly, it can ensure a certain kind of equity in the European treatment across regions. Just as we had with the EPAs, for instance, what we did is there was a general overarching trade committee. I was part of that at one stage, where we tried to ensure that whatever the Europeans gave in one region, it would give in another region. So you were kind of sort of more or less guaranteed that you wouldn't be at any disadvantage in terms of the concessions the Europeans were making. The regional partnerships, I think they would build on what we have at present right now, the joint Caribbean-EU partnership agreement, and deal with political dialogue, investment, and some of the economic matters. And it should be open to other regional bodies. And here I fully agree with the idea that on regional matters, you cannot have a closed relationship. That is to say, if you're talking about sustainable tourism, for example, you have to bring in the ACS. You have to bring in the other countries of the Caribbean Sea. If you, just as in Africa, if they're talking security matters, they have to bring in the African Union. And this is what the Europeans have said very clearly, and it's something which I fully subscribe to. Maybe in this region, if we're talking security on a certain level, we may need to bring in CELAC to be part of that regional arrangement, to be part of this, this regional partnership arrangement. So it has to be flexible in that sense. It cannot be rigid in terms of not recognizing that the other parties in the region that are important in these types of discussions. So that is basically what I want to say. I think that more or less, and I'm not sure if Gert actually said this, but I tend to suspect that there are very few differences between the ACP and the European Union with respect to how to go forward. I tend to think they have set the end of May for a final document, to have a final agreement, and negotiations started a bit late. There was some disagreement among the Europeans, which they managed to sort out. Some felt that we should change the whole thing entirely, just as you had in Africa with the African Union. But I think finally they have come around with that, you know, there's a structure that they can work with. All they need to do is modify it. So I look forward to an agreement in May, and I think the way things seem to be going, we're likely to have that sometime later this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez. And now we are going to our final speaker, and I am hoping that we can carve out after that 15 minutes for discussion. I'm very happy to welcome Ambassador Gail Mathurin, our final speaker this afternoon. Ambassador Mathurin has been the Director General of the Office of Trade Negotiations of the CARICOM Secretariat since 2009. Prior to this, Ambassador Mathurin was Permanent Secretary and Head of the Foreign Service in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of Jamaica. In her capacity as a Jamaican diplomat, Ambassador Mathurin has undertaken several key diplomatic assignments, including being permanent representative to the United Nations and its specialized agencies in Geneva and the World Trade Organization. She was also coordinator of the ACP group in the WTO during the Doha negotiations. She has been non-resident ambassador to a number of European and Mediterranean countries during her assignments in Europe. She has also been High Commissioner to Britain for Jamaica. Ambassador Mathurin has a very long and distinguished diplomatic career since 1979. She has been non-resident Jamaican ambassador to the countries of the Southern Cone in South America, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. And she has been Jamaica's deputy permanent representative to the permanent mission to the OAS in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Mathurin is a recipient of the Order of Distinction, Commander Class, which was conferred on her by the government of Jamaica in 2007. Ambassador Mathurin, we are very happy to welcome you this afternoon. I know that you have an extremely busy schedule. Thank you very much for joining us and to offering your insights as an engaged player in, and I think you have been asked particularly to address the issue of Brexit and the implications for ACP, Caribbean, and EU relations. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Professor Byron. And let me thank you for inviting me to the launch, today's launch. I'm very pleased to be participating. I'm particularly pleased to have seen and heard colleagues with whom I have worked over over the years. And so it's very, 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 as I said, I'm very pleased to be catching up with all of you. I'll try to be very brief because I must say that the presentations so far, I think some of them have been very provocative, and I'm looking forward to the discussion period. I'm going to say a little bit about the implications of Brexit, particularly for the Caribbean. And I think we can all describe the decision by the UK to exit the European Union as a watershed event in current affairs, whose political, financial, economic, and geopolitical repercussions will be, dare I say, disruptive, far-reaching, and long-lasting. And I think we're seeing some of that as we speak. Because of the community, and here I'm referring to the CARICOM, because of the community's close traditional ties with the United Kingdom, Brexit has significant implications for the member states in a number of key areas: political, developmental, trade, economic, and financial. And we should also note that there are also concerns about the impact of Brexit on the British overseas territories in the Caribbean, which have traditionally enjoyed, for example, funding and development support from the European Union through the EDF. In these circumstances, I suggest that the community needs to be proactive and needs to have a continuous evaluation of the implications which will emerge over time as the impact of Brexit unfolds. And in a sense, we're just at the beginning of that process. One of the concerns which I can share with you, the region has identified, is that Brexit could lead to a rise in nationalism and Euroscepticism, resulting in greater emphasis both by British and European politicians on domestic affairs. And as a result, less attention may be directed to foreign policy and economic relations with emerging states such as ours. CARICOM certainly is likely to lose a sympathetic and supportive voice capable of influencing thinking and policy concerns of the community in the councils of the EU. And I think Mr. Laporte suggested in some of the examples he gave, suggested the direction in which some of the thinking of the EU, the direction in which that is going, and the possible, and we can extrapolate on the possible implications for our region. Because I think one of the things we have to recognize is that the EU is a forum where the community has few allies, knowledgeable of and sensitive to the peculiarities of small developing states like ours in the region. This speaks to, I think, the need for CARICOM to make a concerted effort to strengthen relations with the EU 27, bearing in mind that we also have representatives, we also have some of those countries in the Caribbean Sea. And so it also speaks to the need, in my view, to strengthen our relations with our Dutch and French neighbors. There's also the fear that the UK, being preoccupied with the fallout of the decision to exit the EU, its priorities and focus will turn inwards as it seeks to heal the internal divisions and indeed deal with the enormity of the task of raveling its links with the EU and forging new links, including new trading links. And therefore, one could conclude that the UK will be deeply distracted and is likely to pay far less attention to the developing world, including the Caribbean, over coming years. And in that context, it is unlikely that CARICOM will find pride of place in the recalibrating of Britain's external relations and policies as a standalone actor. In that context, though, we should recall that CARICOM and the United Kingdom have pre-existing structures such as the UK Caribbean Forum, which certainly can be used as a vehicle for deepening external relations. And that again speaks to the need for a possibly more proactive outreach and approach by the region. And I think that the absence of the United Kingdom at this time from the councils of Europe at a moment when that very relationship, which we've been discussing this afternoon, will remove an influential voice knowledgeable of the realities of the Commonwealth members of the ACP, in particular of the Caribbean and the Pacific states. We could also see intensification of the tendency on the part of the European Union, and this would be the EU27, to group the Caribbean with Latin America in its engagements in the hemisphere, notably within the context of CELAC. And in this context, again, the negotiations of the post-Cotonou relationship will be very important. And undoubtedly, one of the lessons which I think we as a regional integration movement need to note is that one of the key lessons of Brexit is that the integration processes cannot prosper without the buy-in of the people. Let me just touch a little on the developmental, the implications for development cooperation. With the UK leaving the EU, the European Development Fund will be deprived of that country's contribution, which is approximately 15%. And of course, this will no doubt diminish the available capital of this fund in coming years, and consequently the portion provided to CARIFORUM. I should note, however, that the UK is a contributor to the current European Development Fund, the 11th EDF, and that fund runs until 2024. With the expected shrinking of the UK economy, I think we can also expect that investment and foreign direct investment flows towards the Caribbean should be negatively, could be negatively affected. And we should also remember that a number of Caribbean countries are not eligible, and I think Peter, Dr. Gonzalez mentioned that, are not eligible to receive concessional financing from the UK because of their per capita income. So let me spend a few minutes on the area that I have probably been spending the last year involved in, and this is the implications for trade. As I think we're all aware, the CARIFORUM EU Economic Partnership Agreement governs trade, current trade between the United Kingdom and the CARIFORUM states. Once the UK leaves the EU, that the EPA will no longer govern trade between us. And a new WTO-compatible preferential arrangement will be required in order to preserve that market access and that trade. And although our overall trade to Europe has been falling, the percentage that goes to the UK market is still very important. It's anywhere between 21 and 22% when I last checked of total CARIFORUM trade to Europe. Of course, the market access obligations under the EPA, the current EPA, are currently in place and will remain in place until the United Kingdom formally leaves the EU. But in this context, the UK had signaled its intent soon after the referendum to roll over the provisions of the existing EU trade agreements with third countries, including that with CARICOM, in order to replicate the existing provisions in a standalone agreement, which I indicated would need to be WTO compatible, and which would become operational once the UK formally left the EU. So over the last 12 months, the region, under the umbrella of CARIFORUM, has been working with officials in the UK to develop a separate agreement which replicates the provisions of the current CARIFORUM EU EPA and which could be put in place as early as the end of March 2019 in the event there is a hard Brexit, that is, in the event the UK leaves the EU with no agreement between them in place. We should note here that the draft transitional agreement negotiated between the UK and the EU 27, and which is the subject of much discussion in the UK at the moment, provides for the UK to continue to be treated as part of the EU for the purposes of third country agreements, such as our EPA, until December 2020. But as is very clear, as we speak, no one knows what is likely to happen in the next 6 or 7 weeks. And so all preparations are being made for a hard Brexit. And to that end, we expect that this rollover agreement, if necessary, will become operational on the 30th of March 2019. I think at that point, I think I'd like to end here. I think that what we are seeing with Brexit, and indeed some of the other trends that Mr. Laporte in particular mentioned, is a changing global environment in which the Caribbean will have to find its place. And I think in that context, its continued decision to participate actively in the ACP group in the negotiations that are currently taking place to replace Cotonou, which, as other speakers have pointed out, will envisage an overall ACP agreement with regional components. I believe that the Caribbean discussions and negotiations with Europe will begin in another couple of months. The need to again re-examine how we relate to an EU 27, as well as how we relate to a UK, which is likely to strengthen its linkages with some of the larger emerging economies post-Brexit, means that the Caribbean has to evaluate and calibrate its alliances in what is a very uncertain and discomforting at times world environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mathurin. At this point, I think we can think about 15 minutes of questions and comments. And so what I'm going to ask you, members of the audience, is to, if you have a question, indicate, and a mic will be brought to you. Please identify yourself and ask the question or make your comment as briefly as possible. We'll take a round of comments and questions, and then we will ask the members of the panel, whoever would wish to address it. We are operating on a very short time frame, so over to you. Are there any questions? I see a lady right here. Identify yourself.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Byron. Welcome to everyone. My name is Minnie Tambi. I'm a graduate of the University of the West Indies with an MSc in government. My concern is towards how we are going to move from decade to decade, knowing that history has always made changes with cooperative groups. And hence the reason we have reached a juncture where sustainable development is of critical importance. Can those at the table give some input into what our next decade should be looking towards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question or comment?
Thank you very much, Director. Okay. Now, obviously, my question would have to be based on what I've heard. Oh, sorry. I'm Anselm Francis, former lecturer at the Institute of International Relations. My question would have to be based on the issues raised in this on the Yeah. All right. Yes, based on what I've heard this afternoon from the panelists. And an interesting comment came to me from the reviewer of the book, that is Dr. Harak Singh, identifying the absence to any significant degree of the private sector in the work, ACP work. Now, I'm glad that that issue has been raised because I'm trying to make sense of it. And that is, in a sense, in the context of the changing international relations. Because clearly, given my advanced age, at one stage you're dealing with international relations, and we dealt almost exclusively with states. The attention being drawn to the private sector suggests to me that the discipline of international relations is changing. And in this context, I would like to make a comment on Professor Laporte's contribution, which is, for example, the growing or the decreasing relevance of the ACP. I don't know, I have a little problem with it, because going forward, I can see the subject matter of the EU-ACP relations changing. In other words, then, new issues coming on board. And I think our creating linkages with countries other than Caribbean countries could be very useful. And that the ACP could be a very useful forum in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see another speaker, Mr. Dukaran.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. First of all, there are a lot of, Winston Dukaran from the Institute of International Relations. There are a lot of very deep issues that have been raised. I just wanted to share two things that I have had the experience over the years in dealing with negotiations. One has to do with the issue of the resources and the resource flow in these negotiations. I'd always asked the question, what really was the size of the resource at stake? And I must admit to you that I've never got an answer, either from the Caribbean or indeed from the European Union. And some of it were discussed here today. And I always had a feeling that there was really not much at stake in terms of resource flows. And we were wondering what was the price of this elaborate institutional structure and processes for negotiation, what essentially was minimal in terms of our development impact. So I would like to put that on the agenda for future work, at least, to define the level of resource flows. The second question is one relating to diplomacy, and I was very appreciative of a lot of the comments on both issues with respect to the continuing relevance of the ACP as an institution of global effectiveness. One of the fundamental issues that we faced was in negotiating some of the agenda issues, and specifically one relating to security, where we thought that there was a common ground between the European Union and the Caribbean in our attempt here to try and introduce some proposals to deal with that issue with respect to the Arms Trade Treaty. We found that it was impossible to have a diplomatic reach through the ACP, and therefore, whether or not in redefining its role, the question is not so much what is the diplomatic relationship between ACP and the European Union, but indeed whether or not such a relationship has any possible clout of increasing our diplomatic efforts in the global agenda on issues that we do have common interests on.
Thank you. I see another comment.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Kirby Marie Cattell from the Ministry of National Security. My question relates to CARICOM. How do we as CARICOM then retain our relevance as a trading bloc in these changing environments? How is it that we maintain that relationship and without actually being lumped with Latin America? So how do we maintain that relevance as a region?
Thank you. I think, yes?
My concern is Dr. Gonzalez, Indira Sajuan, PhD student and economist, international relations. Dr. Gonzalez, you started off in terms of the beginning of this arrangement, which is in 1975, 44 years ago. And then you made the point that looking at the Global Competitiveness Index, these countries that were afforded these special arrangements, non-reciprocal in large part under the EPA, it was done because we were not perceived as competitors. And when we look at the Global Competitiveness Index, 44 years later, we've really not moved. So that, to me, it really begs the question in terms of what really is this all about? Because if at the end of the day, we as countries, we're not moving forward in terms of growth and competitiveness, etc., really, what is the relevance? And Ambassador Maturin, you spoke to the issue of the relevance of the UK, and even if there is the Brexit happens, the term slips me hard, a hard Brexit, there will be an equivalent arrangement in place with the UK. And you quoted the stats in terms of the percentage of trade that CARIFORUM is doing with the UK. I would be very interested if you do have the breakdown, to be able to remove the Dominican Republic and indicate the Caribbean, what percentage of our trade really goes today. And if you have that percentage for the rest of the European Union also, would be very interesting.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a very profitable round of questions and comments. I'd just like to, since I have the mic, throw in 3 brief comments, questions of my own before I hand it over to the presenters to reply. First thing is, Dr. Gonzalez, I just wondered, you were fairly categorical in saying that there has been little change in competitiveness rankings. I wondered if there were outliers, such as Mauritius, in which there might possibly be some indication of changing competitiveness rankings. That was one. I also wanted to ask, to comment to Ambassador Maturin that in terms of the non-independent Caribbean, the European Caribbean territories, it's very remarkable that over the last couple of years, the ACS has welcomed several of those territories as associate members. For example, the BVI recently joined the ACS. And Guadeloupe is about to sign an associate membership agreement with the OECS in March. What is happening with CARICOM and the long list of applications for associate membership coming from European territories dating back to 2012 or before? And is there any move to increase our links with them in the light of the need to recalibrate our relations with the European Union? And lastly, I was struck by a number of things that Geert Laporte said, but in particular by his reference to the high-level aspects of the EU-ACP relations and the fact that large sections of the resources available for cooperation have not, in fact, filtered down to other actors, including youthful entrepreneurs, youth groups, civil society groups, who play such an important role in social development and also in production and innovation and economic activity, primarily in Africa, but the same can be said for the Caribbean and for the Pacific. And I thought it would be nice to hear that point elaborated on and what is happening in the current negotiations to address that deficit. I'll now hand over to the panel, whoever wishes to address this round of questions. Who would like to start?
Thank you, Dr. Byron. The first question about the private sector. I think it is true to say that the private sector has always been involved in these trade negotiations, if not formally at the table. It was understood that they were an integral part of what was taking place, especially with Cotonou, because remember, Cotonou was a great deal about the Cotonou preferences: rice, rum, sugar, bananas, coffee. So here in the Caribbean, we did have a group called the Private Sector Coordinating Committee, which was involved in the negotiations and who were able to make their points about the role of the private sector. Remember, I said they were championing what was called a private sector chapter in Cotonou that never really came on board. But there are some other developments that have taken place which really show how the diplomacy is moving. For example, one of the things I mentioned, which was mergers and acquisitions, because these are big private multinational corporations getting together or trying to get together with immense implications for the foreign relations of states and for their foreign policy. And also in relation to what is a fundamental feature of Cotonou and will be of the new Cotonou, the good governance provisions. I mean, all you have to do is think about the Gupta brothers in South Africa and the implications of their operations for the state and for its neighbors. So the private sector is involved intimately in what's happening in these negotiations, whether directly or indirectly. Secondly, the question of resource flows. When we were negotiating the EPA, one of the last things to be determined was what was called the envelope. This is the amount of money that we are going to get. And I do remember at one of the final conferences, a particular prime minister walked out of the meeting because he said he wasn't signing this, the money was not enough. Well, the money will never be enough, I would imagine. There is a figure, the figure is in the EPA, EDF, 11th EDF, the so-called envelope. And I guess he could always keep arguing for more. With respect to the absolute level, I can't remember the exact figure now. Oh, the area where the areas that were listed. Billions. Yeah. Billions. I mean, and there are other kinds of things that were sector specific. For example, when we are negotiating the replacement of the sugar protocol, we were able to negotiate what was called accompanying measures at a level of 2.3 billion ECUs. So it's a substantial amount of money. Well, when it gets to those figures, I can't say what's substantial, because even if you say billion, you know, like that 2.3 billion I just mentioned was the 76 ACP countries. So it's very difficult to find out what would be enough. The arms treaties are a good illustration of the point that I think Gert was making about diversity in the ACP. Because for all the work that was done by you personally, on small arms treaty and so on. You know that in Africa, where states are fighting each other or fighting internally, they may have different ideas about how to restrict the flow of arms into their individual territories, which may be different from ours. So it might be very difficult to get the diplomacy correct to deal with something like that on a global scale. And finally, CARICOM as a region. I'm just going to quote something that is mentioned in the EPA. These are the words. The parties recognize that without prejudice to the commitments undertaken in the agreement, the regional integration is a matter to be determined exclusively by the CARIFORUM states in the exercise of their sovereignty and given their current and future political ambitions. These are words that I heard some say in crafting. I must say, in retrospect, I think it's a little fudge, because it's like we saying this is our business, don't tell us about it, and we are supposed to do it ourselves. There are some questions about how well we do it among ourselves or well we do not do it among ourselves. But in any event, the space is there for us to determine how we're going to deal with our own regional integration processes.
Yeah, well, I think the questions that were directed to me were about 2 or 3. I would start with first the question from Indira. That is to say, we have not moved in terms of our level of competitiveness. And I think I would, even though I would agree with Professor Byron that there are a few outliers, Mauritius and probably 1 or 2 others, but basically we have been stuck at that level. And my point there was really to try to give a picture of how the global system has evolved. We have a number of emerging countries that have evolved, a lot of them in Asia, and they have left a lot of the ACP countries behind. Now, if you sit in the WTO and you see how the negotiations take place, you realize that the WTO only recognizes developed, developing, and least developed countries. In that group of developing countries, there's China, South Korea, Singapore, and all of them. And that is what is at the heart of the problem between the United States and China and some of the others. The whole Doha negotiations collapsed because you couldn't get these countries to accept that they're no longer developing countries. China still defines itself as a developing country. Nobody could say you're not a developing country once you come into the WTO and you say you're a developing country. So South Korea is still a developing country. Singapore is still a developing country, even though its per capita income is way past most of the European countries. So the countries that are in that group, like us, for instance, we find it difficult to get in concessions. So we form the ACP group, we form the small economies group within the WTO, and we then try to negotiate our own package of special and differential treatment. We try to do the same within the international financial institutions, and I think Dr. Dukaran could tell us something about that. He has been involved in it because of the same problem. They want to graduate us. They say, well, they don't recognize this question of vulnerability and that we have a high level of per capita income and therefore we should be treated like the other developing countries, which are much more structurally developed in a competitive sense. So you have that problem of the developing world has evolved since 1975, and it has evolved in such a way that there has not been any sufficient differentiation and graduation. These organizations need to sit down squarely and look at the fact that countries have evolved. The only region that has done that to some extent has been the Europeans. The Europeans have recognized smaller countries. They have recognized because they operate on this basis of structural competitiveness. So the point I'm trying to make is that there is still a need for a voice for what I call the vulnerable developing countries who are stuck at that level of competitiveness, and they need to have an organization that speaks more on their behalf in the international financial institutions, in the WTO, probably in climate change and so on and so forth. That's why I'm saying that there's still the need for the ACP as a group to function. Certainly it can make bridges, it can make links with other organizations that are working in that area and so on. And it was in no way to suggest that the ACP group would be a global player. I don't think that's really the intention. The intention is just to be more effective as an international organization, so you could negotiate probably better within the international system. And I said, but I heard Dr. Dukaram on the point of the arms deal. Was it possible to get the ACP to agree on an small arms treaty? I have not studied the issue, so I can't know all the details that are involved in it. But that is just one of the issues that may come up. There are several issues. For instance, the one that the Europeans are looking at right now is this question of migration. And they believe that if working with the ACP, 79 ACP countries, it may be possible for them to get an agreement within the UN on this global compact on migration. They also believe that within the WTO, we can save multilateralism if they work with the ACP as a group. The ACP countries, and I sincerely believe that we need the WTO. We need a predictable organization based on the rule of law. The day the WTO collapses and they go the way like how Trump is doing with his security tariffs and all of that, we are going to suffer the most as a result. So we need a multilateral system that is based upon proper rules. And the Europeans are very much in favor of that, and they're still trying to work for some kind of, for strengthening multilateralism. So we have common cause with them on that, and we can work further with them. There are several probably other areas. I can't say where all the areas are. They emerge within the system. They are satisfied that they have made progress with us on the climate change. They believe that the Paris Accord may not have been possible if they didn't join together with the ACP and fought for it in the WTO. So I would say there's a role for the ACP as an international organization. Thank you.
Ask if Mr. Laporte and Ambassador Mathurin would like to address any of the questions or comments that have been made. Well, hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I was saying I would like to respond to a couple of the comments, but I would yield to Mr. Laporte if he wants to go ahead. If not, let me just say, let me just respond to a couple of things, if I may. I didn't get the name of the person who asked about the percentage of trade excluding the DR. And unfortunately, I don't have the exact figures. I don't have the figures extrapolated in that way in front of me, but I do understand the direction in which she's going. Yes, the DR is the largest cariforum exporter to Europe and to the UK, and has outperformed and certainly has done very, very well as far as trade in goods is concerned under the EPA. And certainly what we have seen in the CARICOM context is that our goods exports overall to the whole world have been falling, and that is also the case with Europe. Where we are at a slight disadvantage is that we can't accurately speak to our trade and services figures. And in the case of the, certainly, and we know that there is a very vibrant trade and services between CARICOM and particularly the United Kingdom, and of course I'm talking about our tourism sector. But we don't always have accurate figures measuring our trade and services with Europe, and I think there we would see a slightly different picture when compared to the goods side. Jessica, you mentioned you spoke about the associate membership issue. First of all, the British Overseas Territories are all already associate members of CARICOM and have been so for a number of years. As we speak, I believe that proposals with regard to associate membership or the offer of associate membership to the Dutch territories will be considered by our heads of government in another few weeks and again in July this year. While the OECS countries have strengthened, have included, I think, both Martinique and Guadeloupe as associate members, I think there's still some constitutional issues that CARICOM would have to look at with regard to the existing model of associate membership and the DOMS. But it is an issue which is active on the CARICOM agenda as we speak. With regard to the access of funds, I can't speak about, and I'm talking about EDF funds to either private sector or civil society. I can't speak to civil society, but I think we need to recall that the work, that a lot of the work carried out by Caribbean Export, which is a CARIFORUM body, which is mandated to work directly with the private sector in terms of assisting them to, in particular, to use the EPA. A lot of that work is funded by the European Development Fund. And indeed, some of the programs that I'm aware of actually provide financial support directly to small and medium-sized businesses to assist them in meeting some of the requirements of exporting to Europe. And interestingly enough, in the last program of that kind, which which Caribbean Export promoted, there were specific programs targeted at women exporters and entrepreneurs, which is an interesting development in the region, if I dare say so. And finally, I think there was a question about how does CARICOM retain its trading relationships without being a part of Latin America. I don't think the issue or the concern is with trading relationships, because of course we have a CARIFORUM EU EPA, which is indefinite in terms of its applicability. We will also have one with the UK whenever the UK, we will have one with the UK at some point. I think the concern is that Europe may deal with the Caribbean region in other issues, particularly in development cooperation, in the context of Latin America. However, let us not prejudge this issue. Let us see what comes out of the post-Cotonou negotiations, and in particular, the negotiations on the regional compact between the EU and the Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Laporte, would you like to comment on anything?
Thank you very much. I think this discussion is extremely interesting, and there's already a number of issues that we should flesh out even more in detail, maybe through a seminar or a study or whatever. But let me just say that from what I hear and from the various questions that I also got, I see a certain paradox. On the one hand side, we, European Union, other global players are trying to negotiate with big groups of countries like the ACP, all types of major agreements like a new post-Cotonou agreement. But then in practice, in fact, nobody takes account of these types of frameworks. In international relations, we see more and more a shift towards informal groupings, sometimes small groupings, sometimes a bit larger, but we go and strike deals with those groupings where there is a clear interest, where there is a clear value added. And what we see, for example, with the European Union these days is that they strike deals on migration with a limited number of African countries that are directly concerned with migration. And the Valletta process, the Khartoum process, the Rabat process. In Africa as well, we see that countries are building ad hoc alliances beyond the formal regional structures, beyond the formal regs. And I think that's a bit the reality of our international relations context these days. We go for portfolio approaches that can very quickly shift through other types of alliances on certain issues. And there I feel that the ACP is no longer the right instrument. And I think for the Caribbean, it's important that it invests now as much as possible in identifying where and with whom it can build alliances on certain global issues or certain issues of great concern to the Caribbean region. And these alliances can be with the Pacific, they can be maybe with Africa, they can be with Latin America, they can be maybe with other regions, they can be with Europe, they can be with China, they can be with India. But at the end of the day, that's the challenge that each region will have to find real value added in deals with all types of groupings and more informal types of groupings that are not entirely well established. Last remark, or I still have two quick remarks on Brexit. I think we should not be mistaken. If there was one country before Brexit already that was very skeptical about the ACP, it was the UK. The UK and Germany were leading the alliance in Europe that wanted to do away with the ACP. It is after the referendum that the UK has become less visible, obviously, in this debate. But don't be mistaken, the UK was definitely not an ally of the Caribbean or of African or Pacific countries through the ACP framework. They were probably allies of the Caribbean, but using other frameworks than the ACP, maybe for the reasons that I just tried to explain. Last but not least, resources to non-state actors, to youth in Africa, we see a trend that is very worrying. There is a shrinking space taking place. Digital means which are so well used by young African generations are taxed in a number of African countries, or they are simply cut. Internet is being cut. And these are the dynamic forces which need this digitalization to really develop their societies. But more and more we see repressive attitudes. Of course, happily, this is not happening in the Caribbean. So again, prove that the Caribbean is a very different region than some parts of Africa. But this means that there is now a challenge to find ways to reach out to these groupings that really can bring about change in their continent. And there we see that there is not only a problem at the level of some African central states, but there is definitely also a problem at the level of the European Union that is far too heavy in its bureaucracy to reach out to these non-state actors, to these different types of younger generations in Africa. And that's a real challenge for the post-Cotonou negotiators. And I'm not sure whether they will succeed in making this cooperation a more participatory type of, multi-stakeholder type of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Laporte. Dr. Montoute, would you like to add some comments?
Yes, I would like to say something. Thank you very much, Chair. I want to make two comments, and one that is on the relevance of the ACP, and the other one is on the issue of middle-income countries. I don't think that there is one option or one possible option to pursuing relations between the ACP countries with the EU and with other actors. I think that there could be several options or several scenarios within which we engage with the EU and other partners depending on the situation. So we could have an ACP, for example, as an umbrella body, maybe as a political space within which we deal with other ACP countries depending on the specific issue that we are dealing with. But the ACP could function as an umbrella framework, as a broader political body within which, because numbers matter, all right? Numbers matter, and even if we don't necessarily agree or we don't necessarily have shared interest on all issues, there are some issues, as Good said, the Pacific and the Caribbean, we share issues, we share interest in climate change. All right, and then there are other issues like Caribbean and African countries share interest. So I think that umbrella body, but as I said in the beginning, it does not have to be just one option. There could be another option of ACP plus, where depending on the issue that we need to have other non-ACP countries that would be valuable to whatever we are discussing with the EU. All right, so we could have an ACP plus, or we could have an ACP as a broad umbrella body, and then we could have other options or other scenarios where we deal with those issues simply on a regional level, depending on what it is. So I think going forward that I think there should be a multiplicity or a number of options that are open, that we open ourselves to and we avail ourselves to, depending on the situation that we are dealing with. The other issue I wanted to mention is the issue of middle-income countries and the issue of graduation, and that is a very, very important issue for the Caribbean. And I just want to make the point that income-based criteria, I know that there's a lot of work happening on questioning just income-based criteria, GDP as a measure of where we are and the degree to which we get consensual funding or grant funding. And I mean, I mentioned that in my class on Tuesday gone, that we are labeled that way, but one hurricane, for example, pushed back Dominica 25 years. All right, so we have the issue of our specific, our peculiarities. We also have the issue of where we are located. And again, I mentioned that to my class with a Singapore, Caribbean, sometimes analogies that we make in comparison. I said, look at where they're located geographically in terms of, them being a hub in our area. And look at where we are located. We are located between the cocaine producing zone and the cocaine consuming zone. So those kinds of issues, I think, need to be considered in our relationship and in development cooperation going forward, beyond the GDP criteria. I know some of this is happening already, a lot of discussions are happening, but it needs to be sustained and need to be strengthened in our discussions with the EU going forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Montoute, and thank you to the entire panel in terms of responding to the wide-ranging questions. I would just like to remind you all that there are a few copies of the book on sale. Please avail yourselves of the opportunity. And I would like to call on Miss Asabi Rollins, one of the students in our master's program in global studies, who is going to give the official vote of thanks on behalf of the Institute.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to offer the vote of thanks to all those who contributed to the success of today's seminar on these important and quite timely ACP EU matters. Special thanks to the presenters for their insightful commentary, Dr. Montoute for this book which brings some critical ACP issues and perspectives to the fore, Dr. Harak Singh for your incisive commentary on asymmetry, regional integration as a tool for development as opposed to just an end in itself, and your views on private sector, not the private sector being an engine room for development. Mr. Laporte for your well-informed updates on the current status of post-Cotonou and your provocative perspective on the shifting role and relevance of the ACP group. Dr. Gonzalez for synthesizing Caribbean interest in post-Cotonou, and Ms. Ambassador Mathurin for your perspective on CARICOM's need to better orient itself in relation with EU27 post-Brexit. Also want to thank Ambassador Colin Granderson of the CARICOM Secretariat for assisting with the undertaking of today's seminar, the Secretariat of the IIR, particularly Kana McAllister and Michelle Siraj for logistical support. Special thanks to Jared and John for IT support, and the university's marketing department for promotion and advertising. members of the diplomatic community who were in attendance today, as well as the media for coverage of today's event, and finally the audience for your active participation and your keen attendance. Thank you, everyone.
Well, folks, I think that wraps up this afternoon's seminar. Once again, thank you to all our panelists, and a particular thank you to those who joined us by distance means from Maastricht and from Barbados. Thank you, and all the best to you all, and we hope to keep on collaborating with you in the future. Thank you very much, everybody. There are still drinks available at the back of the room if you would wish to have one before you leave. Bye-bye.
I don't know what the